In the shadowed hollows of the Appalachian Range, where ridges fold into one another like a closed fist and the mists of morning cling to the pines well past noon, some stories are not told, but buried. They fester in the soil, seep into the well water, and are carried on the silent breath of the wind. One such story belonged to a place the locals called Croft's Folly. It was a farmstead tucked so deep in a narrow valley that the sun was a guest for only a few hours each day before the mountains reclaimed their dominion. The whispers about Croft's Folly spoke of Silas Croft, a farmer of few words and even fewer companions, who in the early years of the new century took a bride. But this was no ordinary union. The woman, they said, was not of their world. She was a giant, plucked from the highest, most unforgiving peaks of the mountains, a creature of myth and stone. No one in the town of Blackwood Gap ever saw her face clearly. They saw only a towering silhouette in the twilight, a fleeting shape behind a dusty farmhouse window, a figure whose presence seemed to warp the very air around it. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she and Silas Croft were gone. The farm fell to ruin, the fields to weed, and the story to legend. The townsfolk would say Silas had been taken by the mountain, a price for meddling with things best left alone. They spoke of unnatural children, of strange lights and stranger sounds echoing from the valley, of experiments so vile they stained the land itself. But what was the truth behind the farmer who married the giant from the mountain? What were the bed experiments that even the most hardened gossips would only mention in a choked whisper? The answer, like the farmstead itself, was left to rot, forgotten by a community that had perfected the art of looking away. It would take an outsider, a man of law with no ties to the valley's dark soil, to pry open a history that had been sealed not with mortar and stone, but with fear and a conspiracy of silence. And he was coming. Deputy Thomas Fletcher arrived in Blackwood Gap in the autumn of 1926, the air already sharp with the coming cold. The town was a study in gray wood, gray slate roofs, and the gray, watchful eyes of its people. Fletcher was young, but his face carried the premature gravity of a man who had seen the law fail before. He was sent from the county seat not to unearth old ghosts, but to find a new one, a land surveyor from Charleston who had last been seen heading into the hills west of town, his maps and instruments in tow. Fletcher was a methodical man. He believed in evidence, in timelines, in the tangible world. He had no patience for the folk tales and superstitions that seemed to be the primary currency of information in Blackwood Gap. His investigation began, as all such inquiries do, with questions. At the general store, a place that smelled of sawdust, cured tobacco, and suspicion, the proprietor's answers were clipped and unhelpful. He said, "Folks from away don't always understand these hills, deputy. The mountain has its own laws." The blacksmith, a man with arms like tree limbs, merely shook his head and went back to his forge, the ringing of his hammer a clear and final punctuation. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, curated. It was a wall, and every question Fletcher asked was another brick being laid. The surveyor's trail, pieced together from reluctant witnesses, led him inexorably toward the western ridges, toward the valley that housed the decaying bones of Croft's Folly. The path was overgrown, a mere suggestion of a road that nature was patiently erasing. As he rode his horse through the oppressive quiet, the forest seemed to watch him. The air grew colder, heavier, and the trees thicker, their branches interlocking overhead to form a near-perpetual twilight. He found the surveyor's horse first, still saddled, its reins tangled in a thicket of rhododendron, its eyes wide with a terror that had not yet faded. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no tracks other than those of the terrified animal. The man had simply vanished. It was near the entrance to the narrow valley, where the path dissolved completely, that Fletcher felt it most acutely, the sense that he was trespassing. A low stone wall, crumbling and overrun with kudzu, marked the boundary of the old Croft place. Beyond it, a dilapidated barn sagged in on itself, and further on, the farmhouse stood like a skull, its windows vacant eyes staring out at the encroaching wilderness. He felt a profound sense of wrongness here, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air. It was the chill of a place where a great and terrible sadness had occurred, a sadness so profound it had become a permanent feature of the landscape. He knew then, with a certainty that defied his rational mind, that the fate of the missing surveyor was entwined with the secrets of this desolate farm, and with the farmer who had dared to marry the giant from the mountain. Fletcher spent the better part of the day combing the periphery of the Croft property. The place was a tomb. The farmhouse door was swollen shut in its frame, barred from within by a silence that felt ancient and absolute. The barn was a collapsed skeleton of timber, its interior a dark, chaotic mess of rotted hay and broken tools. He found nothing belonging to the surveyor. No boot prints, no dropped compass, no shred of fabric. It was as if the man had reached the stone wall and been lifted from the earth. As dusk began to bleed through the canopy of leaves, tinting the gray landscape with shades of bruised purple and orange, Fletcher returned to Blackwood Gap. The chill of the hollow had followed him, clinging to his coat like a damp shroud. He went directly to the office of the local law, a small, clapboard building that smelled of stale coffee and resignation. Sheriff Brody was a man well past his prime, his uniform strained over a soft belly, his face a roadmap of compromises made long ago. He listened to Fletcher's report with a practiced look of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. When Fletcher mentioned Croft's Folly, a subtle change occurred. The sheriff's gaze shifted, his posture tightened. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest, and steepled his fingers. He said, "Son, let me give you some advice. That place, it's got a history. A bad one. Silas Croft was an odd fellow. Went up the mountain one spring and came back saying he was wed. The woman, if she was a woman, was never seen in town. Then they both just disappeared. Best to leave it be." Fletcher felt the familiar frustration of a man speaking English in a foreign land. He replied, "Sheriff, a man is missing. His horse was found a stone's throw from that property. Leaving it be isn't an option." Sheriff Brody sighed, a long, weary sound. He said, "That surveyor wasn't the first to go missing out that way. Every few years, some fool gets it in his head to wander into those woods. They're never found. The mountain takes them. That's the story we tell, and it's the one that keeps the peace." The conspiracy of silence, Fletcher realized, was not just a habit. It was official policy. The sheriff was its primary enforcer. It was a willful blindness, a communal agreement to not see the monster in their midst. But what was the monster? A mountain? A ghost? Or something far more tangible? He pressed on, his voice low and firm. He said, "I don't believe in mountains that take people, Sheriff. I believe in men who do. Who owns that land now?" The sheriff's eyes flickered toward the window, toward the large, well-kept house on the hill overlooking the town. It was the grandest structure in Blackwood Gap, its white paint a stark contrast to the surrounding gray. He said, "Been in receivership for 20 years. Before that, Silas Croft took a loan against it. From Dr. Finch." The name hung in the air. Fletcher had heard it mentioned several times already, always with a tone of reverence. Dr. Alastair Finch was the town's physician, its benefactor, the man who delivered its babies and held its mortgages. He was the sun around which the small, dim planet of Blackwood Gap revolved. The sheriff continued, his voice softer now, almost a warning. The doctor was a good friend to Silas. Try to help him. When Croft and his wife ran off, the bank was going to take the farm. Dr. Finch bought the dead himself, out of the goodness of his heart. Said he wanted to preserve it, in case Silas ever came back. He's a good man, deputy. The best this town has. Fletcher stood, the meeting clearly over. Every instinct he possessed screamed that the path to the missing surveyor and to the truth of Croft's Folly led directly to the front door of the good doctor. The community's silence was a fortress, and it seemed Dr. Finch was the king in the castle. As he stepped out into the cold night air, the gaslights of the town seemed feeble, their halos of light barely pushing back in overwhelming darkness. He had encountered walls of silence before, but this was different. This was a silence built not just of fear, but of a strange, twisted loyalty. It was a silence that protected something, And Fletcher was beginning to suspect that what it protected was not a myth, but a man. His investigation was no longer about a single missing person. It had become a historical excavation, and he was about to strike the capstone of a forgotten crypt. The following morning, Fletcher made a point of visiting Dr. Finch's clinic under the pretense of inquiring about local herbal remedies for exposure, a plausible concern for a lawman new to the mountains. The clinic was attached to Finch's house, and it was a marvel of clean, ordered modernity that felt alien in Blackwood Gap. Polished wood floors, glass-fronted cabinets filled with gleaming instruments, and the sterile, medicinal scent of carbolic acid. Dr. Finch himself was a man who seemed sculpted from granite and intellect. He was tall and straight-backed despite his advancing years, with a thick mane of silver hair and eyes the color of a winter sky, cold, clear, and missing nothing. He listened to Fletcher's questions with an air of paternalistic patience. His voice was smooth, cultured, a stark contrast to the rough dialect of the valley. He said, "Deputy, I appreciate your diligence, but Sheriff Brody is correct. These mountains are not like the gentle hills you're accustomed to. They are treacherous. Men get lost. It is a sad but recurring fact of life here." When Fletcher steered the conversation towards Silas Croft, the doctor's expression became one of practiced melancholy. He said, "Ah, Silas, a tragic case. A deeply lonely man, you see, prone to flights of fancy." He convinced himself he had found a companion up on the high ridges, a mountain woman, he called her. I believe, in reality, the poor man simply succumbed to his own delusions. The isolation, you understand. It could do terrible things to the mind. It was a masterful performance. Finch painted a picture of a benevolent intellectual struggling to manage the primitive beliefs of the simple folk around him, Silas Croft included. He was the voice of reason in a sea of superstition. But Fletcher saw something else in the doctor's cold eyes. He saw the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. The doctor was too smooth, his story too perfectly constructed, a neat and tidy explanation for a messy and disturbing local legend. Every evasive answer from the townspeople, every veiled threat from the sheriff, now seemed to point not to a spectral giant, but to this man. Fletcher left the clinic with a polite thank you, the doctor's patronizing smile following him out the door. He felt more certain than ever that Finch was the keeper of the valley's secrets. But certainty was not evidence. He needed a crack in the wall of silence, a single voice willing to speak the truth. He spent the rest of the day asking indirect questions, not about Silas Croft, but about the history of the town, about families who had lived in the outer hollows, about midwives and healers who might have served those isolated communities. The same name kept coming up, uttered in hushed tones, often accompanied by a superstitious gesture. Ilara. They called her the Granny Woman, the Herb Witch. She lived alone in a small cabin on the edge of the woods, far from the town proper, ostracized by the very people who sought her out in the dead of night for remedies the good doctor couldn't or wouldn't provide. She was the town's shadow, the repository of its unspoken history. That evening, as the moon rose over the ridge, a pale and scarred disk in the black sky, Fletcher rode out to Ilara's cabin. It was little more than a shack, with smoke curling from a stone chimney and the flickering light of a lamp visible through a single grimy window. The air was thick with the scent of drying herbs and wood smoke. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. He knocked on the rough-hewn door. For a long moment, there was no answer. He could feel himself being watched from within. He knocked again and said, "My name is Deputy Fletcher. I need to ask you some questions." The door opened a crack, held by a chain. In the gap, a face appeared, ancient and deeply lined, with eyes that were dark, intelligent, and filled with a fear so old it had become a part of her. She was the ally the style profile demanded. This marginalized, guilt-ridden woman, he knew, held the key. The old woman, Ilara, stared at him through the gap in the door, her eyes holding the accumulated fear of a lifetime spent on the fringes of Blackwood Gap. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a dry rustle of leaves. She said, I've got nothing to say to the law. Fletcher kept his own voice low and steady, trying to project a calm he did not feel. He said, I'm not here about you, Alara. I'm here about what happened at the Croft farm. I'm here about a woman named Morwenna. At the mention of the name, the old woman flinched. It was a barely perceptible movement, but it was a direct hit. The fear in her eyes was joined by a flicker of something else, grief, or perhaps guilt. The chain remained in place. She whispered, That's a name no one has spoken in 20 years. Go away, deputy. There are things in this valley better left buried. Fletcher pressed his advantage, his words chosen carefully. He said, A man is missing. I think his disappearance is connected to that farm. To what happened there? People are silent because they're afraid. But you're silent for a different reason, aren't you? You're silent because you know. You saw something. He could see the conflict raging in her ancient face. The habit of fear was strong, a shield she had held up for decades. But his words had found a crack in it. He saw the weight of the secret she carried, the burden of being the sole witness to a forgotten crime. He lowered his voice further, making it a plea, not a demand. He said, I am not one of them. I am not part of their silence. Help me understand what happened to her. Help me give her back her name. For a long, agonizing minute, she just watched him, her dark eyes searching his face, weighing his sincerity against the very real danger that talking to him represented. The wind whispered through the pines, a mournful, sighing sound. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she closed the door. Fletcher's heart sank. He had failed. He turned to leave, the taste of defeat bitter in his mouth. But then he heard the metallic rattle of the chain being undone. The door creaked open. Alara stood there, a small, stooped figure silhouetted against the lamplight. She beckoned him inside. The cabin was a single room, cluttered but clean. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a complex, earthy perfume. A fire crackled on the hearth. Alara motioned for him to sit at a small wooden table. Then she moved to a heavy wooden chest in the corner of the room. She knelt with a groan, her old joints protesting, and unlocked it with a small, iron key she wore on a string around her neck. From beneath a pile of old quilts, she lifted a heavy, leather-bound book. It was a physician's ledger, its cover embossed with the faded initials AF. She placed it on the table between them. The leather was cold to the touch. She said, He was careless. A long time ago, I was called to his clinic to help with a difficult birth, the Miller girl. He was called away to an accident at the mine. He left this on his desk. I saw the name. Her name. I took it. I've kept it hidden all these years. I was too afraid to do anything with it. Afraid of him. Her finger, gnarled with age, tapped the cover. She said, The truth isn't a story, deputy. It's an accounting. And it's all in here. Fletcher looked from the ledger to the old woman's face. The fear was still there, but now it was tempered by a fragile resolve. By giving him this book, she was passing a terrible burden and a sacred trust to him. She had broken the conspiracy of silence. She had given him the voice of the victim, written in the hand of the monster. Fletcher took the ledger back to the small room he had rented above the general store. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a stark, yellow light, making the shadows in the corners of the room deep and absolute. He placed the heavy book on the rickety table, its worn leather cover feeling like a slab of cold tombstone beneath his fingers. He opened it. The pages were filled with a precise, elegant script, the handwriting of an educated man. It was Dr. Alastair Finch's private journal, a clinical and chillingly detached record of his life's work. The early entries were what one might expect. Notes on difficult cases, observations on the prevalence of consumption in the mountains, theories on heritable traits among the isolated families of the Hollows. But woven throughout this legitimate medical work was a darker thread, a current of obsession with eugenics, with the improvement of the human stock. Finch wrote of the people of Blackwood Gap, not as patients, but as a closed genetic pool, a subject for study. He wrote with contempt for their superstitions and their physical failings, seeing them as raw material for his theories. And then Fletcher found her. The entry was dated spring 1903. Finch wrote, A remarkable discovery today. Following a lead from a frightened hunter, I ventured into the high eastern ridge, a place the locals avoid. There, in a secluded cabin, I found the family of Jedediah Kane. They are a reclusive and unrefined clan, but their secret is astonishing. They have a daughter, Morwenna, approximately 17 years of age. The girl is afflicted with a profound case of acromegaly, resulting in advanced gigantism. She stands nearly 7 feet in height, with the corresponding skeletal and soft tissue development. The family, steeped in shame and ignorance, has kept her hidden, viewing her as a divine punishment. I, however, see her for what she is, a magnificent opportunity, a unique genetic anomaly that must be studied and propagated. The words were cold, devoid of any human empathy. Finch did not see a sick, frightened girl being hidden away by her family. He saw a specimen. The following entries detailed his careful manipulation of the Kane family. He used his authority as a physician, offering them modern medicines for their various ailments, winning their trust, all the while his true interest was the girl. He wrote, "The family is pliable. Their fear of God is matched only by their fear of my medical knowledge. They have agreed to place Morwenna under my exclusive care. They believe I am seeking a cure for her growing sickness. The fools. The sickness is the cure. It is the key to a new potential, a strength this valley has never seen. The question now is not how to treat her, but how to breed her." Fletcher felt a wave of nausea. This was the giant from the mountain, not a creature of myth, but a teenage girl with a pituitary tumor treated like a prize animal by the most respected man in town. The journal then turned to the problem of a suitable sire. Finch considered several men in the valley, dismissing them for various perceived genetic flaws. Then he settled on Silas Croft. The entry read, "Silas Croft presents the ideal subject. He is physically robust, a product of strong farming stock. More importantly, he is profoundly isolated and desperate for companionship. His loneliness is a tool I can use. He owns his land outright, which provides the necessary privacy for the experiment. I shall approach him with a proposal, one cloaked in the language of compassion and mutual benefit. I will offer him a wife, a companion to ease his lonely existence. He need not know the full scope of my scientific endeavor. He will be the farmer, and Morwenna, the fertile ground." Fletcher had to close the book for a moment, pushing his chair back from the table. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. The marriage was not a romance, not even a transaction. It was a clinical insemination orchestrated by a sociopath in a doctor's coat. The entire legend of Croft's folly, the whispers and the ghost stories, was a smokescreen, perhaps even one encouraged by Finch himself, to hide a monstrous human experiment in plain sight. He had turned a sick girl into a monster and a lonely man into a jailer, and the town had looked the other way, content with the myth because the truth was simply too ugly to bear. Fletcher opened the ledger again, his hands unsteady. He had to know the rest. He had to see it through to the end for Morwenna's sake. The entries from the following months were a horrifying chronicle of the experiment. Finch described arranging the marriage with a cold, logistical precision. He brought Silas Croft to his clinic, painting a picture of a shy, reclusive woman from a distant county who was disfigured and sought a quiet life away from judgmental eyes. He preyed on Silas's decency and his desperate loneliness. Finch wrote, "Croft is susceptible. He is a simple man who yearns for a family. The prospect of a wife, any wife, has blinded him to the peculiarities of the arrangement. I have told him her family wishes the union to be private, to protect her from gossip. He has agreed to all my terms. He will build an extension onto his farmhouse for her to give her space. He believes he is being kind. His naivete is a crucial component of the experiment's success." The day of the wedding was recorded with the same detachment. Finch presided over a private ceremony at the farm. There were no guests. The only witnesses were Finch, a terrified Morwenna, and a hopeful Silas Croft. Finch noted the subject of Morwenna was docile, though her hands trembled. "She is conditioned to obedience. The subjectus, Silas, was awestruck by her size, but he saw not a giant, but a woman. His capacity for self-deception is truly remarkable. I have instructed him on his marital duties, framing them in the context of providing his new wife with the comfort and intimacy she has long been denied. I will monitor their interactions from a distance and through my weekly medical visits. The next section of the journal was titled Bed Experiments, Initial Phase. Fletcher's blood ran cold. The clinical language did nothing to mask the horror of what it described. Finch documented his weekly visits to Croft's Folly, where he would examine Morwenna and interview Silas about their progress. He was not treating her condition. He was ensuring conception. The entries were a grotesque invasion of privacy, detailing the most intimate and painful aspects of this forced union. He wrote, Subject S. Reports difficulty, a natural consequence of the significant size disparity. However, he remains compliant, driven by a sense of duty and a slowly building affection for his unusual bride. He reports that M is gentle, quiet, and frightfully sad. This emotional component is irrelevant to the primary objective, but I have noted it for completeness. I have provided S with certain anatomical aids and positional instructions to facilitate success. Fletcher felt a surge of righteous fury. Finch had turned Silas Croft's bedroom into a laboratory and his marriage bed into an examination table. He was a puppet master pulling the strings of two tragic figures, all for the sake of his twisted, monstrous ambition. Months passed in the pages of the journal. Finch's frustration grew as Morwenna failed to conceive. He began to introduce hormonal treatments, crude extracts derived from animal glands, which he administered to her under the guise of strengthening her blood. These treatments had horrific side effects, which he logged with scientific curiosity. Subject M is experiencing severe headaches, blurred vision, and emotional volatility. These are expected reactions to the pituitary stimulants. Her physical discomfort is a necessary price for scientific advancement. Subject S is growing concerned. His affection for her has become a potential contaminant to the experiment. He sees a suffering wife, not a biological vessel. I must manage his empathy carefully. Finally, there was an entry marked with a triumphant star. Success. Subject M is pregnant. The experiment moves into its next phase. Now we shall see what fruit this unique union bears. Will the gigantism prove to be a dominant, heritable trait? Will the offspring exhibit hybrid vigor? The possibilities are boundless. The words were a victory cry from the depths of hell. To Finch, the life growing inside this sick, terrified woman was not a child. It was a result. It was data. Fletcher stared at the page, at the neat, looping script, and saw the face of pure, unadulterated evil, an evil that wore a tailored suit and a benevolent smile. The tone of the ledger shifted as Morwenna's pregnancy advanced. Finch's entries became more frequent, more obsessive. He documented every change in her body, every symptom, not with the concern of a physician, but with the avaricious hunger of a prospector who has struck a rich vein. He wrote of her immense physical suffering as a mere variable in his equation. The fetal growth is progressing at an accelerated rate, as predicted. This is placing enormous strain on M's already compromised cardiovascular system. Her edema is severe, and she suffers from constant debilitating pain. These are acceptable costs. The primary goal, the delivery of a viable specimen, remains paramount. There was a parallel story emerging in the journal's margins in the observations Finch made about Silas Croft. The farmer's initial hope and naive affection were curdling into horror and despair. He was no longer a willing participant. He was a prisoner, bound to the farm by his complicity and his growing, protective love for the woman he had been tricked into marrying. Finch noted, S has become problematic. He attempts to interfere with my treatments, arguing they cause her too much pain. He speaks of her as my Morwenna. This possessiveness is an unforeseen complication. He has built a wall of sentimentality around the experiment. I have had to remind him of his financial obligations to me, and of the shame that would befall him should the true nature of his bride become public knowledge. Fear, it seems, is a more reliable motivator than duty. The birth was a catastrophe. Finch's entry was written in a shaky hand. The only time his composure seemed to have slipped. He wrote, "Delivery was traumatic. The infant, a male, was grossly oversized and malformed. It did not survive the birth. M has suffered a severe hemorrhage and uterine rupture. Her survival is unlikely. But Morwenna, against all odds, did survive, though she was broken in body and spirit." The failed birth, however, did not deter Finch. To him, it was not a human tragedy, but a failed data. He saw it as a need to recalibrate. After a period of forced recovery, the cycle began again. Finch wrote, "The first trial's failure can be attributed to an uncontrolled variable. We must repeat the process. S is now openly defiant. He refuses to cooperate. I have been forced to take more direct measures." The journal then described how Finch, using his financial hold over Croft and the threat of institutionalizing Morwenna as a dangerous lunatic, forced Silas to continue the experiments. The bed experiments were no longer a manipulated act of marriage. They were now documented, repeated acts of rape, commanded by the doctor and carried out by a broken, weeping man against the woman he had come to love. 2 more pregnancies followed over the next few years. Both ended in tragedy. One was a stillbirth, the other a sickly infant who lived for only a few weeks before dying of what Finch clinically described as congenital frailties. He preserved the tiny body in a jar of formaldehyde, a trophy of his failure. Fletcher had to stop reading. He felt as if he were suffocating, drowning in the ink of the page. This was the dark heart of a legend. The unnatural children were real. They were the tragic, unviable offspring of Finch's monstrous hubris. Morwenna was not a monster. She was a martyr. And Silas Croft was not a fool who ran off. He was a man trapped in a waking nightmare, a victim who had been forced to become a perpetrator. The final entries in the ledger were from the winter of 1906. Finch's tone was one of academic frustration. He wrote, "The vessel is depleted. MS body is failing. 3 trials have yielded no viable results. The genetic material appears to be incompatible, or the gigantism itself carries a fatal flaw. The experiment is a failure. I have instructed S to continue her care, but I will not be investing further resources. I have gathered all the useful data I can. My attention is now turning to other promising local lineages." He had simply abandoned them. After years of systematic torture, after destroying 2 lives and creating and losing 3 more, he had closed the book and walked away, his only regret being the failure of his experiment. The last entry was a single, chilling sentence. "S is unstable. I suspect he may take matters into his own hands." This would be a tidy, if unscientific, conclusion. Fletcher closed the ledger. The silence in the room was absolute, yet it screamed with the silent agony of Morwenna and the despair of Silas Croft. The book was not just evidence. It was a confession, a testament, a gravestone. Dr. Finch had not merely committed a crime. He had orchestrated a private holocaust, and he had documented it with the meticulous pride of an artist. The moral rot at the core of Blackwood Gap now had a name and a face. It was the face of the town's benefactor, its savior, its pillar of reason. The irony was so profound it was sickening. The man who supposedly represented science and progress was a monster wrapped in folk superstition, while the granny woman the town shunned was the true keeper of conscience. Fletcher knew what he had to do. There would be no quiet conversation, no tactical maneuvering. This was a cancer that had to be cut out, exposed to the light, no matter how much the body politic screamed in protest. The next morning, he walked up a hill to Dr. Finch's home. He did not go to the clinic entrance, but to the grand front door of the house. He carried the ledger in his hands. A housekeeper answered, her expression disapproving of this unannounced intrusion. Fletcher walked past her without a word. He found Finch in his study, a magnificent room lined with books from floor to ceiling. The doctor was seated behind a large mahogany desk, reading a newspaper. He looked up, his expression one of mild annoyance at the interruption. He said, "Deputy, this is highly irregular. If you have a medical need, the clinic is..." Fletcher placed the ledger on the polished surface of the desk. The sound was a dull, heavy thud, an accusation in itself. He said, "I don't have a medical need, doctor. I have a historical one. I believe this belongs to you." Finch's eyes fell to the book. For the first time, Fletcher saw a crack in the man's granite facade. A flicker of something, not fear, but a cold, reptilian awareness, passed through his gaze. He recognized it instantly. He looked back at Fletcher, his face a mask of composure once more, but the mask was now visible. He said, "An old logbook. I have many. I imagine it's full of dull observations." Fletcher's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of the tone between them. He said, "It details your experiments on Morwenna and Silas Croft. It details the births and the deaths of their children. It is not a logbook, doctor. It is a murder confession." Finch did not flinch. He leaned back in his chair, a parody of relaxation. He actually smiled, a thin, bloodless line. He said, "Deputy, you are a fanciful man, much like poor Silas. You found an old book and spun a Gothic tale from it. That book contains my private theories, my scientific speculations. To try and present it as fact is absurd. Who would believe you? An outsider against me? The man who has held this town together for 40 years. He was right. It was Fletcher's word, and the word of a dead woman and a vanished farmer. Against the essay, Finch continued, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "You see, deputy, you fail to understand the nature of this place. These are simple people. They need myths. They need monsters in the woods to explain the darkness. They do not need, and they do not want, a monster in a house on a hill. It would break them." It was then that the study doors opened. Sheriff Brody stood there, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. His face was pale, his eyes avoiding Fletcher's. He said, "Deputy, the doctor called me, said you were causing a disturbance. I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." The trap was sprung. The complicit lawman, called to protect the town's true source of power. The system, closing ranks to protect itself. Finch's smile widened. It was over. The outsider had been dealt with. The secret was safe. But Fletcher had spent the night not just reading, but thinking. He had walked the crooked paths of Finch's logic. He had felt the weight of the town's silence. And he had anticipated this very move. He had seen this kind of small-town corruption before, where a powerful man becomes the law. He looked from the sheriff's sweating face to Finch's triumphant one. He did not move. He said, his voice calm, "I don't think so, Sheriff." To Dr. Finch, he said, "You are right about one thing, Doctor. The people are simple, but my superiors are not." He reached into his coat and produced not a weapon, but a telegram. He unfolded it and laid it on the desk next to the ledger. "Before I came here this morning, I sent a wire to the U.S. Marshal's office in Charleston. It detailed my findings, the existence and location of this ledger, and my belief that the local constabulary was compromised. I informed them that if they did not hear from me by noon today, they were to assume I had met with foul play and were to ride to Blackwood Gap in force, with a federal warrant for your arrest and for the exhumation of the grounds at Cross Folly." The color drained from Finch's face. The mask of composure shattered, revealing the panicked, narcissistic monster beneath. The smile was gone, replaced by a snarl of disbelief. Sheriff Brody took a step back, his hand falling away from his pistol as if it had been burned. The name of the U.S. Marshals carried a weight that the town's insular power structure could not withstand. It was an outside force, an absolute authority that did not care for local loyalties or respected figures. Fletcher pressed his advantage. He said to Brody, "You have a choice, Sheriff. You can arrest this man for murder, kidnapping, and a list of other crimes so long it will take a week to write them down. Or you can be arrested alongside him for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Your loyalty to him ends now." Brody stared at Finch, his face a mess of terror and betrayal. He had served the doctor for years, enforcing his silence, burying his secrets. But he had only ever done it because he believed Finch was invincible. Now, seeing that invincibility crumble, his own survival instinct took over. His hand went back to his pistol, but this time it was not aimed at Fletcher. It was shaking as he pointed it, uncertainly, at the man on the hill. Dr. Finch rose from his chair, his face contorted with rage. He screamed, "You sniveling coward! After everything I have done for you, for this town." He lunged, not at Brody, but at the ledger on the desk, his intent clear. He meant to throw it into the fireplace. Fletcher was faster. He stepped forward and drove his fist into the doctor's jaw. The sound of the impact echoed in the silent, book-lined room. Finch, a man who had lived his life by the intellect, a man whose evil was cerebral and detached, crumpled to the floor, undone by a moment of simple, physical violence. He lay among his priceless books, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth, looking for all the world like a shocked and frail old man. Sheriff Brody, galvanized by the act, finally moved, pulling out his handcuffs. The spell was broken. The king had been deposed. The fortress of silence had fallen, not with a bang, but with the dry rustle of a telegram and the thud of a fist. As Brody hauled the dazed and cursing doctor to his feet, Fletcher picked up the ledger. It felt lighter now, its terrible weight transferred to the scales of justice. His work, however, was not quite finished. There was one last piece of the story to uncover. The fall of Dr. Finch sent a shockwave through Blackwood Gap. The arrival of the federal marshals a day later cemented it. The town that had been a fortress of silence became a flood of desperate confession and finger-pointing. People who had looked away for 20 years suddenly remembered strange deliveries to the Croft farm, remembered the sounds of a woman weeping, remembered Silas Croft's haunted, terrified eyes on his rare visits to town for supplies. The community, in its desperate attempt to absolve itself, offered up its memories like sacrifices. But Fletcher had no interest in their cowardly revisionism. He left the marshals to deal with Finch and the unraveling of his financial and social hold on the valley. He had one last journey to make. He rode back out to Croft's Folly, the ledger in his saddlebag. This time he did not stop at the perimeter. He forced the farmhouse door, the wood groaning and splintering. The air that rushed out was stale, thick with the dust of 2 decades and a profound, settled grief. The house was a museum of sorrow. In the main room, a chair was pulled up to a cold hearth, a book of poetry left open on its arm. In the small, sparse kitchen, 2 plates and 2 cups sat in a drying rack, waiting for a meal that would never be served. It was the extension that drew him, the room that Silas had built for his bride. It was larger than the rest of an entire floor of the house, with a high ceiling and a large, reinforced bed frame in the center. A small, crudely carved wooden bird sat on the windowsill, its head cocked as if listening for a sound that had long since faded. This had been Morwenna's prison, but Silas had tried, in his own helpless way, to make it a home. Fletcher knew he would not find them in the house. He remembered Finch's final, chilling entry. "I suspect he may take matters into his own hands." This would be a tidy, if unscientific, conclusion. He went out back, behind the house, to a small grove of apple trees Silas had planted. The ground there was uneven, disturbed. He returned to his horse, got a shovel, and began to dig. He did not have to dig for long. He found them buried together. Morwenna's large skeleton was laid out carefully, almost reverently. Lying across her chest, his arms wrapped around her, as if in a final, protective embrace, was the smaller skeleton of Silas Croft. In his hand was a rusted pistol. The truth, in its final, tragic form, was clear. Silas had not run off. He had not abandoned her. After Finch had declared his experiment a failure and left them to their fate, Silas had made a choice. He had watched the woman he loved, the woman he had been forced to torture, slowly dying from the cumulative effects of Finch's experiments. He could not save her. He could not cure her. So he had ended her suffering. The single bullet hole in her skull was a mercy, an act of love in a world that had shown her none. And then, unable to live with what he had done and what had been done to them, he had turned the gun on himself. It was not a murder-suicide. It was a final, desperate act of justice and a shared escape. Fletcher stood over the open grave as the cold mountain wind sighed through the apple trees. He had found the missing surveyor, The man had stumbled upon the grave, and a still paranoid Sheriff Brody, protecting Finch's secret even years later, had disappeared him. He had exposed a monster and brought a corrupt system to its knees. But there was no triumph in it. The ledger had told him what had happened, but the grave told him why. He looked back at the decaying farmhouse, a monument not to a myth, but to a tragedy born of loneliness, sanctified by science and protected by silence. Justice had been served, but it was a cold, hollow thing. It could not give Morwenna back her life, or Silas's soul. All it could do was give them back their names, and ensure that the story of the farmer and the giant was no longer a whisper in the dark, but a testament etched forever into the grim history of the mountains.